almost 30 years, Judge Mark Wolf's courtroom has been ground zero for some of the state's most notorious cases, a veritable who's who of Boston's rogues and scoundrels. One of his early rulings in the Whitey Bulger case led to congressional hearings about the FBI's use of murderers as informants. He oversaw the trial of former House Speaker Sal DiMasi, and he's made several controversial rulings in the case of convicted transgender murderer Michelle Kosilek. Let's just say he knows a lot about crime and corruption, and now he's taking his ideas to a bigger arena. Federal Judge Mark Wolf will appear before a Capitol Hill Human Rights Commission to propose an international anti-corruption court. Citing nations like Somalia, Afghanistan, Syria, and Sudan, proponents of the court say corruption is the single biggest obstacle to human rights in the world. And that's exactly the point Judge Wolf will make when he appears before the commission in the next few days. And U.S. District Court Judge Mark Wolf is here. Welcome.
Thank you, Emily. Nice to be here.
So the idea is to go after grand corruption, sort of the culture of impunity that exists in so many of these countries. How would it work practically when that's exactly the point, that these countries have impunity? The leadership, Syria, they have impunity from their own government.
Well, actually, it would work in a way that's similar to the way our federal system works in the United States. As you said, there are many countries in the world, from Russia to Nigeria to many in Latin America, that are characterized by a culture of grand corruption, endemic, massive corruption at the highest levels. And it exists because in those countries there's a culture of impunity. The leaders of those countries who are most corrupt won't, understandably, permit the investigation, the prosecution of their friends, their families, indeed themselves. So it's my argument that's getting a lot of attention that there needs to be something outside of those nations to hold those people accountable. And actually, I draw an analogy to our system in the United States. You started the program noting my presiding.
Cases we can't ask about, I should say.
Yes, but presiding in the trial of Sal DiMasi. So there is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, prosecuted in a federal court, not in a Massachusetts court. Because in the United States, generally speaking, the district attorneys don't have the resources to do it. And in fact, they're elected and are part of the political establishment that they're not likely to energetically prosecute. So what I'm advocating really emerges from my experience as an assistant to the Attorney General of the United States after Watergate, as the chief public corruption prosecutor in Massachusetts in the early 1980s, and from my experience on the federal court here. Okay,
so opponents of this say that if you go after this kind of corruption, which they actually call petty corruption, that you end up trivializing bigger war crimes like genocide, and that it would end up being unnecessary because eventually these leaders, even Saddam Hussein, turn over. That was our doing, but eventually the ships get righted.
Well, there's a couple things embedded in that question. One, I'm advocating a court, an international anti-corruption court, separate from the International Criminal Court, which is constituted to deal with genocide and war crimes. However, it's the Lantos Human Rights Commission of the House of Representatives to which I'm speaking on Thursday, because there is a very high correlation between the people who are most abusive, the leaders who are most abusive of human rights, and the leaders who are most corrupt. So if you successfully prosecute somebody for corruption, you will have incapacitated somebody who's abusing human rights.
My basic question is, you say it's going to work like our federal court system. Why would they cooperate? Why wouldn't they, other countries would give them asylum, they would disappear, they'd go into these grand mansions. Look what happened with Osama bin Laden for 10 years.
Well, I think you've identified one of the greatest challenges to the creation of the court. However, even Russia, as recently as 2012, did not want to be a pariah, an outcast in the international system. So Russia very proudly joined the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in the spring of 2012. I'm advocating submitting to a the jurisdiction of a court like this a requirement of belonging to the WTO or being in the OECD, getting loans from the World Bank, which many countries throughout the world need. And if there was a sufficient political consensus, I think that there would be a large and growing number of countries that would submit.
Practically, even if they did, you'd have to have some kind of an international law enforcement team that went into these countries and got these people, and the law enforcement of these countries themselves are not going to cooperate. Is that a fair statement?
It is generally a fair statement, with an exception that I'll mention. But you're right. The court would operate on the concept of complementarity, which also applies to the International Criminal Court. It means that if there's a country that has the will and the capacity to investigate grand corruption itself, its leaders would not be subject to the jurisdiction of this court. And therefore, for example, the United States, I think, would have nothing to worry about, because as I go around the world, and I've talked about this in Russia and China and Turkey and many other places, I say we're not distinguished because we have no corruption. We're distinguished because we do something about it. We have contending forces. But you're right. It would require an elite corps of investigators and prosecutors, impartial international judges to make this work. But part of the reason there is, I think, much greater hope for this than there would have been even a couple of years ago is the very widespread recognition that young people, particularly around the world, do not accept this corruption as a way of life. And it was indignation at this corruption that fueled the protests at Maidan, that drove out Yanukovych. It destabilizes the Ukraine. It destabilizes the world.
All right. We will be following your efforts to establish this international anti-corruption court. Judge Mark Wolf, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.